Hi, and welcome to BMIT's new series on the Digital Operational Resilience Act, or better known as DORA. If you work in the financial services sector, I doubt you have not heard of DORA. Set to come into force in 2025, this piece of legislation targets organizations in the financial sector. However, its principles in IT governance, risk management, and cybersecurity are crucial for every business in today's digital age. In this series, we are going to break down the key requirements of DORA, whilst also exploring how its guidelines can be applied beyond the financial sector. We will be covering topics like IT risk management, IT governance, cybersecurity, building resilience. To gain a better understanding of the topic, DORA, and how it applies to different organizations, I have with me Ivan Galea, who is BMIT's product manager, and BMIT's chief digital and compliance officer, Dione Vella. So, what does DORA ask? DORA emphasizes the need for robust IT risk management frameworks within the industry to enhance their ability to withstand and recover from IT-related disruptions. And here, I'd like to ask the first question that will sort of frame the discussion we're going to have. Dione, first of all, thank you for joining us. What are, in your opinion, the primary sources of IT risk facing organizations today?
Thank you for the invite, David. Well, I think there are a number of significant risks that affect all businesses, not just the financial institutions. Primarily starting from the outside, looking at a bit at what's happening every day around us in the world, even in Malta, on the internet. The threat landscape is changing dramatically. In these past few years, very few years, attacks changed dramatically from DDoS attacks to now targeting employees through phishing attempts. They are the most common kind of attacks, using social engineering. So trying to attack the vulnerability in people to try to steal, in most of the cases, money. Doesn't mean that DDoS attacks stopped. DDoS attacks are still active. Nonetheless, there is a shift in what these criminals are trying to do to somehow either shackle an organization or stealing money from an organization, disrupt operations of an organization, so different kind of threats. On the other hand, so keeping up with this so expanding and very fast landscape is one of the challenges that poses risks on the organization. Legislation also is doing its part. A new set of legislations are being published, and there are more to be published, which are not dictating, but really guiding organizations on what they need to do to be able to comply. You mentioned DORA, I mentioned GDPR. GDPR, I think, in 2018 was the first legislation of this form that, rather than only being a law, it also tried to give guidance to organizations on what they need to do, what governance they need to put in place to be able to comply, in that case, to protect personal information. DORA went a step further, looking at governance from a more holistic point of view, focusing primarily on disaster recovery and business continuity, perhaps, but still looking at the whole governance framework that all organizations need to implement. Keeping up with these two threats, or these two, not threats as such, but these two occurrences basically requires investment investment in people, investment in technology. At the same time, the business needs to continue operate. Customer demand are also increasing exponentially every day. So the business needs to move at a very fast pace. So, and IT has always been and needs to be an enabler to business. So if IT is not managing to keep up with all these fronts, basically, ultimately, it's the business which will be suffering a consequence, irrespective of being victim of a malicious attack, not complying with upcoming or current legal legislations, which most of them also are carrying hefty fines, and not perhaps enabling the business to change to meet the customer demands. So there are many threats that one needs to keep into consideration.
Yeah, you mentioned the business email compromise. We've lately seen quite a high number of incidents coming from our customers that we deal with today, reporting such malicious attacks.
Yes.
But when we talk about IT risks, it's not just cyber security. It's not about cyber criminals or cyber attacks. It's also, when we talk about operational resilience, we're talking about, for example, hardware failures.
Yes.
The service disruptions mainly for the operations. So you have software, you have even, for example, lack of monitoring, you have capacity management or lack of capacity management, and even dependencies between software and hardware. You change infrastructure without looking at limitations or looking at how they integrate together. And these can all cause service disruptions, and it is an IT risk at the end of the day.
And I think that's one of the interesting parts is you mentioned sort of the need to invest in resources. Everything comes at a cost. So we have, on the one hand, you have the size of the organization, you have the cost base, but then it's also the ability to assess those risks. So how are companies expected to effectively assess and prioritize IT risk, both in relation to DORA, but irrespective of DORA, in relation to any approach to managing risk in the organization? Because that's an interesting question that many companies are starting to have now.
I think business owners first need to understand what the role of IT within the organization. I think that is the first milestone, the first gate. Because if there isn't an understanding that IT is an enabler to that business, and IT is being seen as just the old email that I need to send every now and then, but not leveraging IT and leveraging the amount of data that we are generating today and see how we can turn that into a business advantage
To grow
and grow.
and evolve, yeah.
That would be the first stumbling block. So the first stumbling block, realizing that IT plays a role. I've seen organizations still that do not believe in their own IT department, and they might have IT experts within finance, within HR, within. So
Because maybe it's not their core, maybe they don't invest in IT people because it's not their core business, right? They might want to depend or think of IT as, like you're saying, something which,
it's just a cost.
yeah.
But it's like the insurance.
In reality, IT now it's around us. It's a need. It's something that has to be budgeted for and taken up seriously. So.
But then is this across the board, irrespective of whether they're big or small, or do we see differences?
I think probably on the smaller side, I do believe, but it is my personal perception that this problem may be bigger there. On the big organizations, then how much do you invest? How big is the IT budget?
Yeah. Small organization may want to look at MSPs, MSSPs to eventually be their IT arm, so to speak, because even there's the HR element of it. Finding IT skills nowadays, it's quite challenging within itself. So, big organization can throw money maybe, or can throw the effort, to build an IT team or security team, but smaller organization might not have the bandwidth or capacity for that.
IT outsourcing is not something new. It goes back decades in reality. I think today, and again, bringing in these new legislations that are coming along, perhaps one thing that they are trying to enforce more is management of your supply chain. To understand the product you're getting, from whom you're getting it, the suppliers behind your own suppliers, which I think, yes, it is important. Obviously, there cannot be shift of responsibilities. The responsibility still remains on the business, and to manage their risks and to implement or budget depends on the level of risk and on the type of service that they are delivering.
I mean, DORA's primary ask is that they're putting the responsibility on senior management or leadership to actually develop, budget, develop, and implement an IT governance framework, an IT risk management framework, and even an awareness program within the organization. So yes, they are actually, the legislations or the authorities are pushing that the responsibility onto the senior management. It's no longer trying to pin it down to a single person, or it's the entire organization's management, basically.
Some might argue that DORA has opened a can of worms across both the financial services industry, but also across other businesses and industries. So one of the interesting thing is, you mentioned the large and the small business, but essentially the way that we mitigate risk, the best practices would apply across the board, irrespective of your size. What are the best practices to mitigating IT risks?
Look, risk mitigation has a predefined set of strategies. You can mitigate the risk by implementing mitigating controls. Mitigating controls can vary from a simple policy, which is enforced within the organization, to a technology implementation, to regular audits and controls and checks that you do within your environment. So it is the mitigating. You can shift the risk. You can stop using a service. So you are eliminating a risk. So risk management is quite well documented out there. It all depends on, in the legislation, there is the word proportionality. And I think it makes a lot of sense, perhaps in a different context. But what I mean by proportionality is that the level of mitigation, risk investment, it all depends on your own risk assessment. You need to understand your business. You need to understand what's the impact, what's the likelihood of an incident occurring, and then take the appropriate action as you deem required to be able to mitigate that risk to an acceptable level. Let's understand that we cannot live in a risk-free world. Unfortunately, always, everything that we do carries an element of risk, even crossing the street. It's a risk. So you have to take reasonable precautions to be able to handle in case of incident. You need to be able to recover. You need to be able to come out of the occurrence stronger by as a minimum learning. As a minimum, you need to learn from incidents and see what you can do not to have a repeat, because it's a continuous improvement process. You don't usually, and in any case, assume that today you implement the best GRC framework. You invest in the best technologies. You employ 100 security experts. And for today, you are fine. You're not fine in a week's time, in a month's time because things change. So you need to continuously evolve.
Yeah, and it also depends on the risk appetite of the organization. We see some small companies who wants to grow, maybe grow fast, and therefore they, tend to ignore specific risks or push them a little bit aside for the time being to be able to get that growth that they're looking for, right? I mean, again, based on the risk appetite. If you find an organization which has a low risk appetite, which we call risk averse, they take the safer path, and you don't see the growth when you take such a path.
It all depends on the owner, the shareholder needs. Because you have stakeholders within an organization, you have interested parties. If the owner of that business is happy not to risk, but the return is what he was expecting,
Yep.
nothing wrong there. So it all depends on the expectations of the business too, at the end of the day. I think you always need to strike the balance.
I think it's also what DORA has brought about is also a change in mindset at how we look at GRC in general, how we look at risk, how we look at governance. One of the points is that compliance is often seen as a box ticking exercise. You have the framework, you have your points, each one is ticked and you're done. You mentioned the continuous approach to addressing risk. Do you think that DORA is changing the mindset in that compliance is not a one-off, it is something that you need to think long-term? So what you do today, as you said, does not apply necessarily next week. So it's a question of re-evaluating everything that you've been doing.
I don't think it's DORA, the prime factor of continuous improvement. I think businesses always realize that they had to change with the customer demand. They always had to change because legislation also is changing. So, no, I don't agree that DORA is the promoter of continuous improvement. I think there are other factors within the organization which are stronger that will enforce continuous improvement. The continuous measuring, for example, of your controls will also give you an indication of what you need to improve. Business requirements, a product that you're selling today might not be sellable tomorrow, so you need to change product. Changing product means changing machinery, new suppliers, new software, new hardware, new risks. Therefore, you need to continuously improve. The principles of DORA remain the same. But the change is coming from other factors.
What do you think, Ivan?
Well, DORA does influence. I mean, it does influence the organization. And again, I think it's the mindset of the organization, right? They either want to be, I think we mentioned it in the cybersecurity imperative conference, which we had last month. And we said, you're either going to be security first approach or you're going to be compliance first approach. And a lot of companies are going to either see DORA or any legislation as, okay, I need to comply, and they're going to do the bare minimum, tick the box, because they see it as extra cost, as extra effort, and they just want to tick that box to get on with their core business. But I think the first approach that these entities need to do is understand what they are really asking, what it really means. And in reality, what they're asking is nothing new. You mentioned it yourself. It's IT governance should have been there. IT risk management should be there. It's about these entities embracing those and understanding the benefits of having such frameworks in place. So I think the influence is now pushing these entities to really have
So
these
DORA
frameworks in
is the
place.
start. the continuous evolution.
I think it's
is
open.
something
It's
else.
opening eyes to specific entities. I mean, bigger entities already had a level of practice when it comes to IT governance and risk management. It's maybe fine tuning
Smaller
their
organizations.
it's smaller organization. I mean, I heard specific organizations, financial entities that don't even have a security policies in place, and I'm like, what? We're 2024, man. You have to have a security policy in place.
But also one of the things that came up in the conference was, I think it was a question from an audience member, is so how do we actually go about DORA? If we don't have the resources, where do we start from? I know that BMIT has been working quite extensively on preparing for DORA in terms both from a company perspective, but also how can we help clients. So what is the starting point for a company that needs to be compliant with DORA?
In my opinion, is starting from a risk assessment, understanding what I am doing, how I am doing it, what are the risks in that operation, and then start building from what is my risk level, and then start building from there. Obviously, you need to have documentation, yes. You need to have, you need to manage your own suppliers, yes. You need to implement a governance framework, yes. Does it has to be as stringent as ISO 27001? Probably not. Take the framework, use it as a guidance, and again, depending on your level of risk, decide to what extent you're going to take it. ISO is a good framework to follow. Why? Because inherently it gives you today 97 controls you can implement to manage your IT risks. You can select which controls apply to you and those that do not apply to you, and how you implement those controls. Obviously, if you do not have built-in within your organization IT people, IT resources, you can always ask for help. But understanding your business, what you are doing, how you are doing it, it's your responsibility because you know how to do it.
Ivan, last question so that before we wrap up. Dione mentioned the risk assessment. This is something that BMIT actually does.
Yeah,
right?
we can
help them.
We can help customers understanding more sort of advise customers understanding their IT risk management framework, understanding the current do an analysis, their current posture on IT risk management, and hopefully guide them towards an enhanced risk management framework. And if those customers or entities that do not have an IT risk management in place, we can start guiding them into implementing a risk management framework. Hopefully they have already some baseline, so to speak, but if not, we can start that journey. It is important. I think the first stepping stone is implementing an IT risk management framework, identifying those risks, as Dione mentioned, doing that risk assessment, business impact analysis, and so forth.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. That's the end of this first in the series on DORA. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our hosts and our guests on episode 2. Thank you.
Thank you.